Prussia, but the couple had no children, and Frederick died in 1827. The third brother, William, Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, abandoned his long-term mistress and married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. After Frederick's death, William was next in line for the throne, and any legitimate children he had would become his heirs, ahead of his younger brother Edward, the fourth son, but William had no legitimate children. Victoria's father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of George III, and he quickly married Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria, in 1818 in order to continue the line of succession. The widowed Victoria already had two children from a previous marriage. Her daughter, Princess Theodore, would become Victoria's beloved half-sister and companion. Upon her birth, Victoria took her place in the order of succession behind her uncle William IV, any of his surviving children, and her own father. At 8 months old, Victoria's world was overturned when her father died suddenly in January 1820. The family were left with large debts and found themselves under the controlling hand of Sir John Conroy, Edward's equerry, and an ex-officer in the Royal Household Artillery, who claimed that Victoria's father had asked him to take care of his widowed wife and child. When she turned 4, Victoria began her education under the tutoring of Reverend George Davies. Her new tutor was said to be patient and polite and encouraged her to develop her talents. She completed her lessons according to a strict timetable and was particularly good at languages, learning to speak French, German, Italian, and Latin, as well as the English which she used at home. She also benefited from the guidance of a singing teacher, the opera singer Luigi Lablache, and drawing lessons from esteemed painter Richard Westall. A rigorous education was not the only hardship in Victoria's childhood. Her childhood was strictly regimented by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and John Conroy. Her mother increasingly depended on the controlling Conroy, partly because of the limitations of her English. Conroy was highly ambitious and exerted his influence over the Duchess and Victoria with the intention of controlling the throne, a tactic that would have been especially effective if Victoria were to ascend the throne under the age of 18 and so require her mother to act as regent. The Regency Act of 1830 had made provision for Victoria's mother to rule as regent if King William IV died before Victoria reached majority age, a decision which displeased William as he distrusted the Duchess. Conroy set about attempting to increase the popularity of the Duchess, who was unpopular amongst the wider royal family.
Granger knows that if you're a school custodian, cleanliness is your top priority. That's why you can rely on Granger for a range of cleaning products and equipment, from disinfectants to floor scrubbers. Granger, for the ones who get it done. What's this brand?
Quality brand. These parts we don't pay big brand markups.
So we save money?
Darn tootin'.
Difference is that save your money. It's an Aldi thing.
This is Wonderlash. I don't think they sell this anymore, but
What kind of spells you put on her?
Rated R. Only theaters May 15th.
Strict rules were established to govern the royal household and Victoria in particular, rules which became known as the Kensington system. As a result of these rules, Victoria grew up in isolation and naivety. All forms of independence were frowned upon, and she was constantly supervised. She wasn't allowed her own bedroom and had to sleep on a small bed in her mother's room. She was not even permitted to walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand in case she fell. Victoria later described her childhood at Kensington Palace as isolating and demoralizing. Given this isolation, the child Victoria had very few friends and was left to entertain herself. Some of Victoria's favorite childhood hobbies included drawing, writing stories, and making costumes for her collection of dolls with her beloved governess, Baroness Lesen. She also kept a diary and wrote over 60 million words across her lifetime. She spent hours playing on her own or with her little dog, the King Charles Spaniel Dash, and even had trousers made for him. She referred to this time as one of the loneliest of her life and had only her equally loved governess and her dog to company. Although Victoria grew to resent her isolation and the rules created by Conroy, they did in some ways work in her favour. Her mother and Conroy's determination to keep her weak and dependent on them by keeping her away from people they thought undesirable, including her father's family and especially King William IV, who had several illegitimate children, had backfired. Her absence from court ensured she wasn't associated with her unpopular uncles and predecessors, George IV and William IV. Equally, archival research by the historic royal palace's curators has suggested that Victoria's later recollection of her unhappy childhood was misremembered. There is plenty of evidence that her mother loved her deeply and spoiled Victoria. She was surrounded by her beloved governess and supportive tutors. She even enjoyed trips to the coast, the theatre, and the ballet, which she loved the most. She also went on several royal tours around the country between 1830 and 1835. An avid writer, she recorded these excursions and noted down her impressions of the country. She wrote of her shock after seeing the Black Country in the West Midlands, so named because of the smog caused by iron making and coal mining, on one of her earliest trips. The country is very desolate, everywhere smoking and burning coal heaps intermingled with wretched huts and carts and little ragged children. To William IV's annoyance, Victoria was greeted warmly by crowds of people at every point of her journeys. William disliked the way that these tours seemed to present Victoria as his rival rather than his heir, and compared them to royal progresses. A medieval royal tour in which the king would be greeted at every town he stopped in with formal ceremonies and festivals. Victoria too disliked these tours, partly because of their exhausting nature and partly because of William's disapproval, but her mother forced her to continue with them. In 1835, Conroy made his biggest attempt to solidify his control over the future queen. During another tour, Victoria contracted a severe fever while at Ramsgate, a seaside town in southeast England, and Conroy and her mother took advantage of her state to badger her into making Conroy her private secretary. But Victoria resisted, as she had during all of Conroy's previous attempts to get himself an official position on her staff. As her uncle the king finally approached the end of his life, Victoria was viewed as the nation's hope. She emerged from her isolation and from the strict rules of her mother and Conroy as a bright new prospect, a new start for the monarchy. On the 20th of June 1837, Victoria was awoken early at 6 a.m. to receive some unexpected
What the hell
visitors
did I
at
do with
Kensington
this?
Palace who were bearing important news. She went downstairs and, unusually, saw these visitors alone, and while still wearing her dressing gown. Chief among her visitors was Lord Cunningham,
What the
the
hell
Lord
did I
Chamberlain,
do
the most senior officer of the royal household,
with
who told her
my...
that her uncle, the king, had died at 2:12 a.m. Victoria was not queen, and at age 18, she was old enough to rule alone. One of the first actions that Victoria took was having her bed removed from her mother's bedroom. This was not the only step she took to break free from the influence of her mother and Conroy. That day, the day of her accession, Victoria dressed in mourning black to honor her uncle and made her first public appearance as queen alone. stepping confidently out of her mother's shadow. Her first official appearance was a success. 97 councillors, cabinet ministers and officials arrived in the Red Saloon at Kensington Palace for their first meeting with the new Queen. The Duke of Wellington later described this gathering of the Accession Council and noted that despite the new Queen's petite size, Victoria was only 5'1", she had not only filled her chair, she filled the room. Flushed with the success of her first appearance, Victoria set about asserting her influence and crafting a new life for herself. She fled the confinement of the Kensington system and left Kensington Palace itself for Buckingham Palace, which became her main residence. She dismissed Conroy and kept her mother at arm's length by installing her in a distant apartment in Buckingham Palace and later in a house in Belgrave Square. Her governess, Baroness Leeson, was invited to live in Buckingham Palace as Victoria's companion. It was around this time that Victoria dropped her first name, Alexandrina, and went solely by Victoria. Despite her outward confidence, Victoria did admit to feeling nervous on her coronation day. Held on the 28th of June 1838, the coronation drew thousands of people out onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the young new Queen. Victoria later wrote in her diary that the sight of the cheering and waving crowd from her carriage calmed her nerves. How proud I felt to be Queen of such a nation. The coronation itself did not run smoothly. The bishop fumbled his lines and called the ceremony to an end too early. An elderly peer had a fall, and the coronation ring was placed onto the incorrect finger. But the elated public would not remember these mishaps as they enjoyed fireworks and a fair at Hyde Park, as well as free access to the theatres across London. As with many important moments in Victoria's reign, care was taken to allow the public a glimpse of the monarch and a chance to celebrate the monarchy. Unlike her coronation, the first year of Victoria's reign passed without any serious missteps. Her youth and distance from her unpopular predecessors encouraged a rose-tinted view of her reign. Many people looked forward to a new and hopeful era under her rule. Her petite size, youth, inexperience, and gender resulted in people underestimating her. Her gender had barred her from taking up the throne of Hanover upon which her predecessors had sat, because ancient Salic law excluded women from Hanoverian succession. Instead, her father's unpopular younger brother, Ernest Augustus Duke of became King of Hanover, as well as Victoria's heir, until she had a child. But Victoria was determined to succeed as monarch of Britain, writing in her diary, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young and perhaps in many, although not all things, inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." Her rosy first year was followed by a harder second one, partly as a result of her over-dependence on her favourite ministers and advisers, particularly Prime Minister Lord Melbourne of the Whig Party and King Leopold of Belgium. Victoria's reliance on Melbourne and their close relationship caused rumours to spread that the new Queen was under the Prime Minister's influence, and even, despite a large age gap of 40 years, that they were having a secret romantic relationship, a rumour that has never been proven. It seems more likely that the inexperienced Victoria relied on Melbourne for advice and looked up to him as a father figure. Given that Melbourne was widowed and childless, many, including aristocrat and diarist Charles Greville, noted that he was passionately fond of her as he might be of his daughter, if he had one. In the year 1839, two political scandals threatened to tarnish Victoria's reputation. The first was a court intrigue involving Lady Flora Hastings, a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother, who was rumoured was expecting an illegitimate child with Conroy. An abdominal growth, later proved in a post-mortem to be a large tumour on the liver, fueled these rumours. Victoria, who harboured deep resentment against Conroy and her mother for her restricted childhood, believed the rumours and demanded evidence. Lady Flora initially refused to submit to an intimate medical examination, only acquiescing to an examination in February, which proved that she was a virgin. The Hastings family, Conroy, and the opposing Tories turned the press against the Queen, claiming that she had spread false rumours about Lady Flora, and Victoria was hissed at during public appearances.
Damn it.
To make matters worse, another political scandal quickly succeeded the first, the bedchamber crisis of 1839. Lord Melbourne had resigned as Prime Minister after the Liberal Radicals and Tories voted against a bill to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica. The bill passed by a narrow majority and removed political power from the plantation owners who had resisted the abolition of slavery. A Tory government was to be formed under Robert Peel, but Victoria's refusal to allow Peel to appoint her ladies of the bedchamber, as was the political custom, caused a political crisis when Peel refused to govern under the restrictions.
Sorry, I don't feel
Victoria
like
had
talking.
imposed. Melbourne returned to office, and many questioned Victoria's ability to rule as a constitutional monarch, a figure who should sit above and apart from the politics of Parliament. When support for Melbourne in the House of Commons finally dried up in 1841, the ladies of the bedchamber most associated with the Whigs were replaced as Peel became Prime Minister during the 1841 general election.
When everything on the IHOP value menu is just $6, you can go all out. Because eggs, bacon, and fluffy pancakes are just $6 every day. And OMG can't do BLT, and it comes with fries. Celebrate every day for just $6 with the IHOP value menu.
Don't just take charge. Take charge. Start your comeback today at PurdueGlobal.edu.
Tonight, the NBA playoffs continue on Prime. Knicks, Sixers, Spurs, Wolves. Game 3, the NBA playoffs, presented by Google. Tonight at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. It's on Prime.
The moment I saw Relay and what it was capable of is the moment that I knew it was something good.
It's really helped reduce stress, and it's helped organize my brain. It's given me in real time feedback on the financial health of my business.
Okay.
Just as the dominance of her mother, Miss Conroy, had waned, Lord Melbourne's influence over Victoria was also to come to an end. Her next confidant and chief political advisor was to have the greatest impact on her life and reign, her husband, German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria and Prince Albert had first met in May 1836. Albert, who was also Victoria's cousin, was invited to visit Kensington Palace by Victoria's mother and under the encouragement of his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. A union between them had been planned by their families almost from birth, despite King William IV's disapproval. He had wanted to avoid another Coburg royal match and preferred Prince Alexander of the Netherlands as a suitor. Victoria and Albert had already become friends during Albert's visit in 1836, but it wasn't until 1839 that Victoria decided she was ready for marriage. On the 23rd of November 1839, Victoria summoned the Privy Council to Buckingham Palace to declare her intention to marry Albert. She had carefully evaluated the parade of eligible princes which had been sent her way and concluded that Albert was extremely handsome, with a most delightful countenance. She had already written to Albert's uncle, King Leopold, at the age of 17, before she was ready for marriage, thanking him for the prospect of great happiness you have contributed to give me in the person of dear Albert. He possesses every quality that could be desired to render me perfectly happy. Victoria's decision to marry Albert was complex. As Queen, love could not be the only motivator for marriage. Though Victoria did love Albert, she decided to marry partly because she needed support with her royal responsibilities and partly to win public approval. When, on the 15th of October 1839, she proposed to Albert, as royal protocol demanded, Victoria gushed at his acceptance. The couple embraced, and Victoria later wrote joyfully in her diary, "Oh, how I adore and love him, I cannot say." Victoria and Albert's wedding on the 10th of February 1840 was a public affair. It was the first royal wedding which had been planned with public enjoyment in mind. The people of London enjoyed a view of Queen Victoria in an open carriage ride on her way to the ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a fashionable white satin court dress instead of royal robes, appearing as the woman she was as well as a queen. The style has been copied by brides since.
There it
She
is.
also wore an orange blossom wreath over her veil, a brooch made by Albert, and earrings and a necklace made of Turkish diamonds. Prince Albert wore the uniform of a British field soldier. Photographs were taken of the happy couple in their wedding clothes and were shared widely. Victoria's wedding, the white dress, carriage ride through the streets, the cheering crowds, set the pattern for all future royal weddings involving the main line of descent of the royal family. A fanfare of trumpets announced the bride's procession. Lord Melbourne headed the procession, with the Queen following on the arm of her uncle, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, who took the place of her late father. Victoria revelled in her marriage. It became a true love match. She wrote in her diary that her wedding day had been the happiest day of my life. The couple enjoyed a short but sweet honeymoon and proceeded happily into married life together. Despite Victoria's status as queen, both Albert and Victoria were traditionalists. They both believed that the man should be the dominant one in any marriage, yet Albert proved to be a devoted husband, and Victoria's first pregnancy in 1840 helped to ease the situation. As her pregnancy progressed, Albert supported her, reading her the daily dispatches from the government when she wasn't well enough to get up. They worked closely together on side-by-side desks at Buckingham Palace, and Albert gradually became, in effect, Victoria's private secretary, taking on more of her responsibilities as she approached the end of her pregnancy and began increasingly devoting herself to motherhood and her family. Albert had encouraged Victoria to work towards improving her relationship with her mother, and it was while the pregnant Victoria and Albert were en route to visit the Duchess that 18-year-old Edward Oxford attempted to assassinate her as she passed in her carriage. Oxford's gun was fired twice, but either the bullets missed or, as he later claimed, the gun was not loaded. He was tried for high treason, found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, was committed to an insane asylum and later deported to Australia. In the aftermath of the attack, Victoria's popularity rose, and the Hastings affair and bedchamber crisis were forgotten. But this assassination attempt and the acquittal of Oxford encouraged further attacks, including in 1842, 1849, 1850, 1872, and 1882. Later in life, Victoria showed great bravery when, after dodging an assassination attempt while out riding along the Mall in London on the 29th of May 1842, she agreed to ride out again on the following day so that John Francis, the would-be assassin, could be lured out and caught in the act by plainclothes policemen. But Victoria's popularity among her subjects was most rooted in her motherhood and the perfect image of the royal family she created. Victoria and Albert were devoted parents and were thrilled by the arrival of their first child, Princess Victoria, or Vicky, Their family quickly grew despite the difficulties Victoria experienced during pregnancy. Their first child, Vicky, was followed by Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Eleanor, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Victoria suffered postnatal depression after many of her pregnancies and vehemently disliked breastfeeding. By the time of her 8th and 9th pregnancies, she promoted the use of chloroform as pain relief, despite the protestations of the clergy, who saw it as against biblical teachings, and some members of the medical profession who thought it was dangerous. The royal couple shared a great interest in their children and took great pleasure in raising and educating them. They presented an image of a happy family to the world, sharing their joy on holidays and birthdays with the public through the new illustrated newspapers. Albert took an active role in parenting, spending lots of time playing with his children, unlike many aristocratic fathers at the time. Victoria happily described her husband's wonderful relationship with their children in her diary. He is so kind to them and romps with them delightfully. Albert crafted joyful scenes of domestic Christmases, popularizing festive traditions, such as decorating a Christmas tree, which have survived into present-day British homes. The image of the happy domestic royal family added to Victoria's popularity. She became a symbol of marital harmony and domestic bliss, widely known to be driven by strong moral convictions, which made her very popular with the rising middle classes. Her financial prudence meant that she successfully cleared her father's debts, and she ran a relatively simple home for a royal, in sharp contrast to the excesses of her predecessors. Victoria recognized that public opinion rose when she openly devoted herself to her children, and letting Albert take over some of her royal duties proved to be a wise decision. Upon their marriage, Albert had been granted the formal title of HRH Prince Albert, but had been popularly known as HRH Prince Consort, a title which Victoria formalized on the 29th of June 1857. The effective working partnership between Victoria and Albert was summed up by Charles Greville in 1845 when he wrote, "They are one person, and he likes and she dislikes business." Albert aimed to create a new, powerful role as Prince Consort. Recognizing a rival in influence over his wife, Albert persuaded Victoria to send her confidant, Baroness Lesen, back to Germany for a quiet retirement. After the death of Prime Minister Melbourne in 1842, Victoria became entirely dependent on Albert. Albert's wise guidance and connections proved invaluable to Victoria, but she still took ownership over decisions which were important to her. As the Great Famine tore through Ireland, killing over 1 million people and displacing another million, Victoria was denounced as the Famine Queen in Ireland. In January 1847, she donated £2,000 of her personal money to the British Relief Association, an amount worth several million in today's money, the greatest donation made by any individual. She supported the repeal of the Corn Laws, which were keeping the price of grain artificially high and fueling the devastating impact of the famine for Irish people. She boldly ignored Protestant opposition to support the increase of an annual grant from the British government to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, a dilapidated Catholic seminary in Ireland. Later rumours of Victoria's cold indifference to the plight of the Irish and the story that she had only donated £5 to the relief and had given the same amount to Battersea Dogs Home on the same day were fabricated. Victoria's first visit to Ireland in 1849, when the famine was almost at an end, was a success, though it had no lasting impact on the growth of Irish nationalism. Victoria and Albert both took a keen interest in Europe, and especially in improving foreign relations between Britain and France. Victoria became the first British monarch to visit a French monarch since King Henry VIII had visited King Francis I of France in 1520. Through Albert, Victoria Victoria was related to the House of Orleans via the Coburgs and visited King Louis-Philippe I in Normandy twice, in 1843 and 1845. When Louis-Philippe returned the visit in 1844, he became the first French king to visit a British sovereign, and when he was deposed during the revolutions of 1848, he sought exile in England. Demonstrations in England by the Chartists and Irish nationalists failed to attract the widespread support that revolutionary movements were seeing on the European continent. Albert was also responsible for the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was designed as a public celebration of technological innovation and the growth of trade. Albert was very intelligent and highly interested in trade, industry, art, and science. The Great Exhibition featured over 100,000 exhibits from across the world and even displayed the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond from India. As Albert was socially conscious, perhaps more so than his wife, the Great Exhibition was fairly priced to allow anyone to visit. The top price season ticket of 3 guineas was equivalent to over £2,000 in today's money, but there were also cheap day tickets available at the reasonable price of 1 shilling. Over 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. It gave many people their first taste of the wider world and was widely lauded as a huge success. Victoria herself was so enthralled by her husband's project that she visited the exhibition almost every day for 3 months. The Great Exhibition also had foreign admirers. Napoleon III of France invited Victoria and Albert to the Exposition Universelle in August 1855 after visiting the royal couple in London earlier that year. They were also guests of honor at an extravagant ball at the Palace of Versailles and visited the tomb of Napoleon I on their trip. Victoria and Albert also sought to bolster relations with Albert's German homeland. In 1858, Albert's favorite child, Vicky, their firstborn, was married at age 17 to Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, the future Kaiser of Germany, on the 25th of January 1858 at the Royal Chapel of St. James's Palace in London. Albert hoped that the liberal education he had given his daughter would help her steer Prussia and later the German Empire into a liberal constitutional monarchy based on the British model. But he hugely miscalculated, overestimating the strength of the very small middle class in Prussia and underestimating the popularity of conservatism. Vicky was not to have the happy life which her father had when he married into a foreign royal family. Vicky was criticized for her overly British views on monarchy and her English origins. She was ostracized by the royal house of the Hohenzollerns, the conservatives at the Berlin court, and her rising political opponent, Otto von Bismarck. As tensions deepened between her childhood nation and the nation of her marriage, Vicky became very unpopular and suffered.
Premium cuts of meat without the premium flavor.